when you're reading an ancient text and you come across all these really specific, sometimes kind of strange rules? Well, today we're going to jump into the purity code from the book of Leviticus. We're going to break down one interpretation of these laws on everything from food to disease to see if we can find the logic behind them.
And that's a totally fair question, right? To us, today, these super detailed regulations can feel a little random. Why focus so much on the physical details of life? Well, the interpretation we're looking at today suggests there's a surprisingly clear logic behind it all, and it really starts with one central idea.
So, all that logic, it really comes down to one single powerful idea. The perspective we're digging into argues that before any of the specific rules can make sense, you first have to get a handle on the core concept they were all built around.
And that core concept? It's all about holiness. The Hebrew word is kadosh, which this interpretation defines as being set apart or separated. And the key thing to get here is that this isn't about being perfect. It's about being fundamentally different, completely separated from all sin and impurity.
And this is where it all clicks into place. This interpretation argues that the people were called to reflect God's own holiness. So think of these external physical laws as a kind of practical training ground, a daily exercise to teach them what it even means to be set apart.
Okay, so how do you take this big abstract idea of being set apart and actually apply it to everyday life? Well, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the purity code and see how that idea of holiness was put into practice.
Let's start with the dietary laws. This interpretation explains them as a really clear system of classification. For an animal to be considered clean, okay to eat, it had to fit some very specific criteria. On land, it had to have split hooves and chew the cud. Not one or the other, both. In the sea, it needed both fins and scales. You can see it's a really orderly system.
And what's so fascinating is when you step back, you start to see a pattern emerge from these rules. Generally speaking, the clean animals were docile, they were plant eaters, and they lived pretty close to humans. And the unclean ones? They were typically the wild predators or the scavengers. It creates this very clear separation between the domestic and the wild.
Now, this whole idea of separation wasn't just about what you ate. Let's look at childbirth. After having a baby, a new mother was considered unclean for a certain amount of time. And the thinking here, according to this interpretation, isn't that this was some kind of punishment. It was a practical and protective separation, giving her time for rest, for hygiene, and really to safeguard both her and the newborn.
And these separation periods were super specific. After the birth of a boy, the total time for purification was 40 days.
But for a girl, that time was doubled to 80 days. What's interesting is that the perspective we're exploring points out that the text itself never actually explains why there's a difference.
All right, and then you have the laws for things like infectious skin diseases. The source highlights this very careful step-by-step process. A person with a suspicious spot was brought to a priest, then they were isolated for 7 days. After that, they were re-examined. If it still wasn't clear, they were isolated for another 7 days before any final call was made.
So, why? What was the whole point of all these rules? Well, the interpretation we're looking at gives us a two-part answer. It suggests there was both a very practical design and a much deeper symbolic meaning behind the whole system.
And this two-part answer is really the key to the whole thing. On the one hand, you have the practical side, which makes a lot of sense, right? These laws promoted hygiene, they helped prevent the spread of disease, and they protected new mothers. But just as important was the symbolic meaning. All these physical states were used as metaphors for spiritual ideas, constantly teaching this concept of separation from impurity.
And here's where this interpretation points out something kind of mind-blowing. That 14-day diagnostic period, those 2 7-day blocks, is remarkably similar to the 14-day quarantine period modern medicine often uses to confirm if someone has an infectious virus. It's this ancient practice with a surprisingly modern ring to it.
So in this symbolic system, leprosy was basically the ultimate physical picture of what sin was like. A person diagnosed with it had to do things that were a visual representation of this separation. They had to tear their clothes to show their sorrow, cover their lip as a sign of degradation, and actually shout unclean to warn everybody else to stay away.
So it all comes down to this. This interpretation argues that having to deal with physical uncleanness, whether it was from a dead animal or mold in your house or a disease, it was all a constant hands-on lesson. Every single instance was a physical, daily reminder of the need to stay separated from spiritual impurity, which they understood to be sin. Okay, so that's the ancient context. But what does any of this mean for us today? Well, the source material wraps up by connecting these ancient, external practices to what it presents as a timeless, internal principle.
You can really see the progression here. In the past, you had these external laws about things like diet and hygiene. The whole goal, according to this view, was to train people in this idea of separation. And all of that training was meant to lead to its modern application, an internal kind of holiness, where you apply that same principle of separation to your inner spiritual life.
And really, that is the main takeaway here. This interpretation argues that this whole, complex system was never just about controlling what people did on the outside. The real point was to shape their internal character, to train a mindset of holiness by practicing physical separation day in and day out.
So that leaves us with one final big question to think about. Even if we see the specific rules as belonging to another time, could that core principle, the idea of separation, of mindfully choosing what to engage with and what to set apart, could that still offer us a useful framework for thinking about our own mental and spiritual well-being today?